Hey guys, this is Will, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about how to stay relevant as a professional software developer in 2025. Obviously, there's a lot of things going on in the world today, both big, giant geopolitical stuff to conversations about things like AI and LLMs. So trying to put all those pieces together is kind of out of scope for what we can talk about today. But what I wanted to get into was practical advice for either how to become or stay relevant as a working professional developer in 2025. Take a lot of the background stuff as given and just really focus on what does it mean to make sure that you can stay gainfully employed. The idea here is to give you kind of a punch list of stuff to go through that will either help you with stay in your current role, continue to grow your career, get a job if you don't have one already, and also maybe if you're starting out in the industry and you're trying to figure out how in the world you can kind of get hooked into it. I'm going to go through both, start with a few non-technical things, and then I'm going to switch over into the technical stuff. First thing is just make sure that you understand the business model of the place that you work at. I'd be surprised at how many developers, they kind of lose track of how does this company make money and how does that connect to the work that I do. Understanding how the company makes money affects potentially how it will be impacted by all the rest of the geopolitical stuff. So, for example, does the company rely a lot on federal contracts or working with overseas companies? So if you know what that looks like, that will give you a way to understand and plan what's going forward. It also is something that's really good to talk to directly with managers and recruiters, showing that you're interested in the business side of things. The next tip on that line is to be a little more sympathetic to the managers and the recruiters. If you can, try to invite them out for coffees or lunches, talk to them as a human being, and just keep it professional, but listen, right? If you can get somebody talking about their challenges or their issues, and obviously right now, if you're anxious and worried about things like AI or LLMs or geopolitical stuff, there's a very good chance that the managers or the recruiters are worried too. And the only caution I would have is it's going to be this very complicated little dance to getting through what could potentially be challenging political conversation. Keep it grounded, especially in things like, well, how does this affect the company? All right, now we're going to go ahead and pivot to some of the technical skill components. First off, obviously, if you're a professional software developer, you should be really comfortable working with source control, working with build systems. If you haven't used at a minimum things like GitHub before, and maybe just even some basic GitHub actions to handle your builds, that's going to put you way behind, and that's a giveaway that you're not really a professional engineer, probably like an indie who only works solo or something like that. That will make it really hard for you to either get hired or move into an enterprise environment. Kind of related to that, you have questions about team etiquette. And this is something that I'm intrigued that it often isn't covered in an interview loop, but things like understanding how to do a good PR. So it's clean and it's concise and it's not, I reformatted the whole code base and now I just submitted a PR for that. Just little etiquette things like that you should be aware of. In a lot of ways, professional software development is all about working in a team and having those skills both from a human interaction standpoint, but also understanding why you don't make all the changes. And I mean, I did this when I was a kid, like my first job, it was like, I'm going to come in and clean everything up because I want to show that I'm awesome. I suspect that for a lot of folks, when they go into an enterprise environment, it's actually going to be the other side. It'll be overwhelming. There's going to be zillions of legacy systems, and just trying to get focused and clear about what things to change and what things to not is a skill, and it's an important one for professional work. Next one, if you are especially looking at server-side roles or back-end roles, you really need to understand and work well with things like automated testing and CI and CD pipelines. If I talk to someone who says they're a back-end engineer and they do things like REST services or any other back-end work, and they say like, oh, I don't really believe in automated tests, that's an easy pass. That's something that shows that you haven't tried to deal with it at scale. It also sort of reflects that interop for how you work together. If I write a bunch of tests and they're important to make sure that I know that these builds are going to work, and I'm working with someone who doesn't believe in it and they just mark the test as skip, if it doesn't pass, that's going to be insanely frustrating. There's this sort of weird misnomer that like it's easier to do manual testing, especially on backends, that I've never really understood. Once you've got a little harness to write test suites for REST services, it's much, much easier to do that through some test suite than it is to try to do that from scratch. The way that might come up in screens is somebody might say something like, well, I don't see a lot of the value in automated testing, or that's a QA job. If I hear somebody say that, then that's an easy, hard pass. on the candidate. The part that I think where it comes up as nuance is like if somebody starts to get into complexity, like, well, you need to be very careful about how you handle UI level testing to make sure that you don't overbuild it so it's still providing value, but is also able to be manageable. That's an example of a kind of nuanced response to that question that I personally would find very compelling. Next one is, and this is a sort of an interesting topic in terms of how it can be emotional for some of the developers nowadays, and that is the use of things like AI and LLMs. If I'm talking to someone and they're either too hyped on it, like LLMs are just going to write all of our code in the future and software engineering is dead, or if you're too negative, like if you say like, oh, LLMs only produce garbage, that tells me that you probably haven't used them very much. And that's kind of telling because it means that you're the sort of person that is both not learning about the current or new technologies, but you're also comfortable with, frankly, kind of shooting your mouth off a little bit about it, which is not a great thing because that means it's also probably how you're going to view a lot of other things. Like let's say that there's a new JavaScript framework, because of course there is a new JavaScript framework, and they start really shooting off their mouth about opinions about that without any experience. That's not the sort of person that, at least personally, I'd want to work with. I want somebody who's going to be grounded and, more methodical and scientific about how they think about stuff. AI and LLMs are just one piece of that. If I hear someone talking about AI and LLMs and they've never used a local LLM, but they start talking about how that technology works, that's again an example of someone where they're more comfortable talking about it than actually doing the research and the homework. Next one, get clear about if you're doing greenfield work or legacy work, both when you're talking to managers, recruiters, your own projects, and then plan appropriately for that. If you're working with a legacy system, which is a lot of enterprise, and so a lot of the high-end commercial work for enterprises looks like legacy system work and integration, you need to be very careful about breaking things, because if you destroy the wrong system and it brings an important business function down, you might have just accidentally broken many times your salary and cost structure because of a mistake. So you have to be thorough and careful with all that kind of work, and that implies a certain level of patience and responsibility. If I'm talking to clients, managers, and they're very invested in doing big bang cutovers on legacy systems, that's a little bit of a warning sign. I do have a whole video I did on legacy systems, how to manage them, how to do the cutover, so feel free to check that out. The Greenfield side of thing is often where it can seem very fun because Greenfield's brand new stuff, but also that's the side where Greenfield is the more challenging around requirements usually. Legacy system in some ways is just like an embodied set of requirements, and then you're trying to evolve and manage through that. Is that more or less stressful than saying like, well, now we're going to meet and build completely new stuff from scratch, and then you have all the cycle and churn on that kind of work. The more experienced developers I've known start to get to where they prefer working on some of the legacy system stuff, in part because they don't have that thrash. Get clarity about what it is you're doing and why, and that conversation will also help with working with managers and recruiters and things like that. Next one, be comfortable with cloud-based tools at the most foundational level. That could be things like AWS or GCP or Azure. It could be a little bit higher up the stack, and it could be things like Supabase and Cloudflare and Vercel, stuff like that. This tension that we've had for years, and it's going to almost certainly get worse. You'll have proprietary cloud tools, you'll have open standards, being able to have a conversation. So as a CTO, you're often worried, like, if I put too much investment in a proprietary tool, then I'm going to have problems with single vendor sourcing. But also, if I want to get things done quickly, there may be a proprietary solution that will let you jump ahead on that. Understanding that people sign deals with these providers and being able to have calm discussions about that is important. If you, for example, have spent the last year just saying that, Azure's terrible, and then there's a new CTO that comes in and they announce that they've just signed a new deal with Microsoft as part of the big new project that they're doing, now you've a challenge to work through. I would recommend establishing yourself as just somebody who's part of that conversation, and you're evaluating the pros and cons, but it's not an emotional thing. It's not like a hot thing. It's just part of the conversation. And part of that includes this important notion around making mistakes. So it's not uncommon for a company or individuals to make a bad pick. Let's take JavaScript frameworks, for example. That stuff's churning so fast. And so what looked like a good pick, may look terrible 3 years later or 2 years later. And that's just life. Instead of making it like heated or personal, just make it feel like a collaborative thing and have those conversations and try and keep it rooted in, technology and understand that there will be an emotional component as well. So if someone picks something wrong, if you give them an off-ramp for being able to change their mind later, that can be really important, which is actually not just a bit of technology advice, but that's actually just a good life choice. If you happen to be at a firm right now and it feels too autocratic, or if it's doomed or what have you, in a lot of ways, I'd recommend just go ahead and start talking to recruiters about that. Don't make life miserable for others. There's a famous book by Edward Yordan called Death March, and it talks about projects that are kind of doomed and why that happens, what's going on with it. Right now, we're at a lot of churn. And so, a financial challenge related to, the parent company that's an offshore, an overseas company, and they're going through financial problems. So now they're going to pull money out of your company, and that leads to problems. There's nothing in your control about that. And to a certain extent, we're all just going to get kind of affected by these things. We just have to kind of get through it. That means is that when you go into work, you want to be level and balanced about it and don't make people miserable. One of the best things about tech in a lot of ways is that people move between jobs. A stay of 1 year to 3 years is pretty normal, and that ebbs and flows. Take that into account. And this is obviously a very challenging time right now because we've seen a lot of folks get laid off over the last few years. And so there's been this contraction. But even now, there's a little bit of balancing out going on. And keep your eyes open. So that could be both just, if you're in a job right now, or things could change quickly. I was thinking about how I would describe the difference between a junior dev and a senior dev in the most simple way. And I think the most basic is that the senior dev knows how to fix things when they break. If you get a performance ticket, the senior dev could isolate that down to, is that bad HTML in the browser? It could be some bug or problem in the middle tier. It could be a bad database query. I've had horrible performance issues that it turned out were related to an Apache HTTP deconfig file that happened to be degrading the HTTP connection status. So everything looked fine when you just hit the app server directly, but because of this one config file in Apache, it broke everything. And so the ability to get into the weeds and diagnose that stuff, that is the difference between junior and senior. And I suspect that that's actually going to be one of the issues going forward with AI and LLM technology. What we're seeing is people producing a lot of code, and you'll hear people talking about things like vibe coding, where they just chat with the AI and it writes all the code and you don't do anything. And the issue is that stuff breaks or it goes sideways. And even frankly, if the AI is in a sense perfect about the code it's writing, it won't count logic problems. It won't necessarily sort through integration problems. And then you get these weird error messages and, you may not be able to fix it. And that is the difference between a junior dev and a senior dev. It is possible that LLMs hypothetically could get to where they write all of the code. And when we see that happens, we're probably also going to have general purpose LLM-based robotics. So the implication there would be that the vast majority of both white collar jobs and blue collar jobs would become obsolete. And I'll be really blunt. If that happens, we have much bigger problems than whether or not the error message is manageable or not. It means that the economies as we understand it today will shift. The thing is that we don't know if or when that will happen. We've been in this state now for a while where LLMs keep being pretty good and they keep getting better, but they're not hitting 100% perfection. And one of the little metrics for this is liability. When an LLM provider is willing to provide legal liability coverage for the code that it produces, that's when you know that then they'll be good enough to sort of be this like economically destroying thing. In the meantime, what they look like is tools that produce code, but they still need a human being involved, especially for when things go sideways. So for example, let me give you a simple example. Let's say that I tell an LLM to write a email and password login page. And I say, if the user types in their email address and their password, let them into the site. So that sounds really simple, but did you cover the negative case? Did you say, well, and it may seem really obvious to a human being, but if I say, well, if they don't put the right password in, refuse to log them in. It's a subtle, dumb thing in a lot of ways, but that's an example of how a human being sometimes has to be involved just to deal with logic challenges and thinking through all those pieces. The state that we're in now, where things slowly get better, kind of like they are today, but it could be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, who knows? It's hypothetically possible that in the next year or two, we get perfect LLMs and perfect LLM-based robotics. But short of that, we're still going to need developers to come in and fix these systems. And if you have a scenario where you have 10 or 100 times the amount of code that's being generated, but now you need to debug all of it, and people talk about whether or not that's a fulfilling career, frankly, like being the guy that fixes this stuff. I'll take it over being a plumber if those are my choices. Nothing wrong with being a plumber. I totally get it. I'm just saying, for me personally, if I had to pick between the things, that's all I'm getting at. Anyway, all right, now we're going to pivot to languages and stacks. And I'm going to use a little bit of a portfolio model with a buy, hold, and sell system. Buy means go learn it if you don't know it. Hold means that it's awesome if you know it already today, because it may be really useful for legacy projects, migration, a lot of day-to-day enterprise stuff. But it probably isn't something you're going to see a lot of new apps being built with. And then sell means I would recommend getting away from it immediately. If you have systems that are already in place that are on the stack, I'd move away from it. So let's first start out with Java, which is where I've spent, many decades working with Java at enterprise scale. And when I started with Java, there were all these things like using it for desktop and mobile and stuff like that. But over the years, it has evolved to today, it really is exclusively for enterprise web services at scale. It's rock solid, is awesome at that. I'm also not sure that that's a growth stat going forward. For enterprise, for legacy, for doing work on those kinds of big web services at scale, I think it's fine, but I'd still call it a hold. Next is COBOL and other legacy languages and stacks like mainframes and stuff like that. All of that stuff is really fascinating because if you happen to have the right background at the right job, then it actually could work really well. By way of example, Costco, which is kind of based locally, they have a lot of COBOL that they use in their back-end systems. And so if you want to work there, then being comfortable with that and or being open to learning and interested is a good thing. That said, of course, obviously for almost everybody, it's a sell situation. Different enterprises are going to have different levels of migration, and that looks like thin slice moving off of it. Like I said, I've got video on that kind of stuff, but that's a sell. Next one up is C#. I like it a lot. I've used it a lot, especially in the gaming space. I built a whole game in Unity with C#, which is actually pretty cool. But my experience has been that it's limited to specific domains. So gaming it's very popular, and then also there's a lot of shops that are very Microsoft centric. So if you want to work in one of those environments, that's great. Again, I'm not sure how much of a growth space that is, so I call that a hold, just like Java. Next one up is TypeScript. So I have built stuff with TypeScript over the last 2 years or so now. I've done mobile stuff, I've done desktop stuff, and web services, and I continue to be really impressed with it. I find its collections and type stuff to be richer than Java and C# now. It's just a nice stack, and I see so much investment in that. I've lost track of how many times I go to pull down an SDK for something, and there's a TypeScript, JavaScript, maybe a Python pack, and then maybe there's no Java or C# SDK. So I just keep running into that sort of thing over and over again. In a lot of ways, it's an open environment. I'm targeting open standards for what it outputs. I can do kind of anything with it. It's a buy. Absolutely. Next one up is C and C++. I would call those sells, and Rust is the buy. If you need it for hardware specific stuff, you're gonna need it. I wouldn't recommend it, Rust for web services at scale, unless it's very specific stuff, and you're gonna know if you need it. Next one up, Oracle and MySQL. I'd call those both a sell, and I would put Postgres as a hard buy. Especially one of the things I find really interesting was do deep dives on, for example, how Supabase uses Postgres as its backend for things, including Postgres ecosystem components for authorization, REST services. So check out GoTrue and Postgres, which lets you write sprocs and expose them as REST services. It's so fast and easy, and so many of the things that I would consider to be especially departmental apps, or even, frankly, a lot of the middle tier stuff that I've done over the years with Java and C#. Frankly, you could do something like that with REST services with Postgres much quicker. It's a hard buy. You see Postgres being configured for use for everything from document storage model stuff to basically kind of things that we use transaction processing systems for. So it's just a really nice ecosystem, and it's a hard buy. Next up is Docker. I'd consider Docker a buy, even if you don't use it personally. It's just really good to be comfortable with it conceptually. So that's a buy. Kubernetes, I would say, is a little bit tougher because you've got some tensions there with some of the cloud systems. And so at some point that becomes like this conversation about, is this developer role stuff or is this IT services? And I would call Kubernetes a soft buy or a hold, at least for the developer community. If you are comfortable with and want to go into a lot more of the things that look like developer environments and managing the systems and the kind of what classically would be considered the IT side, then Kubernetes is obviously, another thing to put into your stack. All right, next one, low code and no code tooling. This is a tough one because a lot of developers who over the years have been handed an app that was built with a tool like this, they go like, it's garbage. And that even goes back to things like Dreamweaver. People would build a site with Dreamweaver and then a developer would be like, what this is terrible. I don't know what to do with it. Nowadays, today, I think this is a little bit trickier. If you go into the entrepreneur forums, a lot of those folks will say things like, don't even hire a developer for a long time because you want to do as much as you can to get an MVP out and use a drag and drop tool like Bubble or something like that. There's another one called WeWeb, which I like better because it does a better job at hooking into things like Supabase and REST services. If you're a back-end dev and you want to get a UI done, you have this interesting thing here. Do you take the time to just go through learning how one of those tools work, or do you try to pick up an entire JavaScript framework stack? Regardless, I think that you'll see a lot more companies using that kind of tooling, especially for enterprise and what we used to call departmental level apps, but they're not their front customer facing app, but it's internal tooling. And so if you can just use a drag and drop tool to build something like that quickly and easily, that's going to be very productive for you. I have a friend of mine who's working at a place right now, and he's kind of more in the earlier stages of his developer career. He's now building stuff using Microsoft's Power Apps, which then means that the company gets to jump ahead for a lot of approvals on things because Power Apps get a different level of review than a purely hand-coded app. And that kind of thing, that's where you've got business dynamics that are driving tech stack selections. And so even though, like, personally, I'm not sure I'd want to build stuff with Power Apps, it's working for him and for them, and they're getting stuff done with it. So instead of just saying like you don't want to participate or you're not part of that, I would actually flip it around and say that you should be open to and want to do things like evaluation. Let's say that there are dozens of low-code, no-code tools that are targeting enterprise development. And so instead of just poo-pooing the whole thing as a class, I would recommend leaning in and learning about them and doing fair evaluations to see how they look. This is like a no-brainer. LLMs are a buy. Learning how they work, how to integrate them into apps and software is critical. Now there's this new spec for writing plugins, the MCP service stuff for how you get your apps and your tooling to integrate with and talk to LLMs. You want to be somebody that's actually used this stuff. One fun way to do that is to pull down a template for an MCP service that does something cool or neat, and then try hooking that up into an LLM. A lot of folks are building MCP service integrations with all sorts of crazy stuff. I saw one for, video editing with DaVinci Resolve, so you can use your AI to produce your videos, things like that. I don't know how real some of that stuff's going to be, but I suspect that you'll just see this huge growth in that space. A lot of people mocked a lot of the chatbots that people were using, and then they were trying to replace their customer service stack entirely with LLMs and chatbots. I don't think that makes sense for a lot of reasons, which would be another whole topic to cover. But being able to clearly and articulate to the business why having a customer service chatbot that could be used to read data and display it in a way for the users that's nicer might be valuable, but perhaps you don't want to let the LLM write transactional data back to the system for various reasons. If you can look a customer or a manager or a recruiter in the eye and say, yeah, I've written a service that does MCP and talks to an LLM, and this is why you'd want to use it here, and here are the risks. And I do think that highlighting some of the legal risks might be a part of that conversation. All right, last tip. I would strongly encourage looking for jobs online in places other than LinkedIn and Indeed. They're fine, but the issue is that almost everyone is hitting them hard. We're seeing some challenges around whether or not job listings are fraudulent or not, which is depressing. And then you'll also see these job posts on LinkedIn, and there'll be 300 people have applied already in the first hour type stuff. So it's discouraging. What I would suggest is check out some of the more specialized lists and boards. I'll give you an example. So I really like Svelte, which is a modern JavaScript framework. And so there are resources to look for jobs for Svelte. Those could be the sub on Reddit. It could be forums specifically dedicated to it. And so if you are a fan of Svelte, you would know about those, and then you could then post jobs and get responses that are going to be a lot more focused and coherent than trying to go through just a general we do all jobs kind of space. Another example of that, there's a lot of job boards for remote jobs, but one that does jump out is for government jobs specifically. There's some job boards, and I'll include some of the links in the description for this stuff. Let's say that you were a federal employee and now you're looking for a new job, and maybe you're interested in moving into a state job because maybe the state might be taking over some of the functionality that the federal employment or the federal job used to do. A lot of those government jobs are posted on a government job specific board, and they may not ever make it to LinkedIn or to Indeed. And they might even have requirements for how the data is managed and things such that they don't want that data to go into a private commercial space. You want to look at lots of different forums. You want to look at both your domain that you're interested in. So let's say that you've got a specific thing like, charitable causes. You want to look for specialty job forums for that, and also for your tech stack. All right, I covered a lot of stuff really fast. If you don't know or recognize any of this stuff, it's okay to stop, go back, and research this stuff. If I threw out what, MCP servers, what the heck is that, right? So go ahead and research it. If you're curious and you want more information on one of these topics, feel free to add that in the comments and I'll investigate that. It's okay to bookmark the video, come back, you can watch this video like 5-10 times. It's totally fine. Not a problem. And on that note, thank you so much for your time. I hope this video was helpful for you, thought-provoking. I know things can seem pretty crazy right now, and it is important to just still remember, get up, go to work or do your job and pay your bills and all those things. Enjoy spending time with your friends and your family. All that stuff is still important in these crazy times. We've gone through periods over the last couple of years of a lot of jobs, especially for the developer community, shrinking. And to be perfectly honest, that may be what we're looking at for the next year or two. But in the meantime, it's up to you to still look out for yourself and you and your family and think about what you're going to do going forward. And I hope some of this is helpful for you. Take care. Good luck. And hope to see you soon. Bye.